We will continue with exception handling today. Uh, so this is where we left off, uh, looking at the types of exceptions and errors that Java supports, all subclasses of the throwable class. Now, exceptions can sometimes also occur in methods called by other methods. So in this figure, for example, we have a method called method1, which is calling another method called method2 in its try block. And method2 can throw an exception, and you can see there's something new over here. After we declare the name of the method, we follow that by two words, the keyword throws and the type of exception that method2 might throw. And inside of method 2, of course, at some point you actually have to throw that, explicitly throw that exception. Like, for example, over here we have an if condition, and if whatever condition that is, that error condition, if that occurs, we are explicitly throwing a new exception object. That has to be declared in the method's declaration up here. And what's different here is that instead of handling this thrown exception inside of method 2, it is being caught in method 1 from where method 2 is being called in its catch block. So like before, the try block is matched by a catch block in method 1. Methods can also throw not just one type, but different types of exceptions. In that case, the syntax changes slightly. So like this, so the first example over here is basically the example that we just saw, a method throwing one type of exception, and we basically add the keyword throws followed by the type of exception object after that. Now, if we have multiple places inside this method where exceptions may be thrown, let's say at one place an IO exception may be thrown, at another an object of type superclass exception, then we can specify that like this. We just put in a comma between the different two exceptions. So far we've seen the way to throw an exception is using the throw keyword, throw new whatever the exception type is. So we're basically creating a new exception object over here. Just like for objects, you can do this in 2 steps. You can declare and create the exception object in one line and throw it in the next. This has a disadvantage that you have to think of an object name, and whereas in the first case you don't have to name the object, which makes for easier reading. Here's an example of a method called setRadius, which throws an illegal argument exception, and you can see the new part of the code in yellow. So we have to add throws illegal argument exception to the method declaration, and over here, when this illegal argument is detected, we have to throw the exception as well. in cases where a block of code might generate different types of exceptions, uh, our try catch block structure changes, can be changed to something like this, where we have one try block with all of the statements, which may again throw different types of exceptions, but we can have multiple catch blocks underneath. So we can have one catch block for each exception type that might be thrown in this from inside this try block. So each exception type can have its own exception handler. It's another example of where we have a method invoking another method called method 1, and method 1 in turn invokes method 2, and method 2 in turn may invoke some other method 3, which might produce an exception which can be caught over here. Method 2 may throw back an exception which can be caught over here, and just like that, method 1 may throw back an exception which may be caught over here inside method. Now let's come to an example. This is a class called circle with exception, and the corresponding test program is called test circle with exception. Now, like I said, I expect you to try out these examples yourself. So let me show you what's new with this classed circle with exception. It's a little more readable. So circle with exception over here has two member variables, radius, and a static variable of type integer called number of objects, which is going to track the number of objects of this class that are going to be created or that are going to exist at any one time. It has two constructors, one constructor that takes radius value as argument, the other one a no-arg default constructor, which in turn just calls the constructor, this other constructor that takes a radius as argument, passes it a default value of 1. So in any case, we're calling the constructor that takes a radius as an argument. Inside of it, we call the set radius method to assign the new radius value to the radius member variable, and we increment the number of objects counter. Other than that, we have a get radius accessor method, we have a get number of objects accessor method, we have a find area method. So since we have the radius, we want the class to do something. We're also computing the radius, or actually we're computing the area of that circle. We have we're using exceptions inside the set radius method. Now, obviously, a circle has a radius. A radius has to be greater than 0. A circle certainly cannot have a negative radius, and a radius of 0 is almost just as meaningless. It's really just a dot. So what we want to do is we want to make passing of a value of radius that is not a positive number. We want to make that illegal, and we're going to make that illegal by throwing an illegal argument exception. So inside the set radius method, which as you can see throws an illegal argument exception, If the radius is greater than or equal to 0, proceed and assign the value to member variable radius, but otherwise throw an illegal argument exception, and we are passing this string, kind of a helpful error message. We're passing that to the illegal argument exception object in its constructor. So you can usually put in a helpful message that will help you debug or figure out where the problem happened, what problem happened. You can usually pass that to exception objects. Okay. This is the test program. We're going to quite straightforward. We have a try block and a catch block. In the try block, we're going to create one circle with exception object C1. First one is passed a positive value for the radius. The second one is passed the value -5, and the third one the value 0. Now -5 and 0 are both problematic. So what we expect to happen is the first object is created. The second one will generate an exception in the set radius method, which is passed back to the constructor. Which in turn passes it back to the main method over here, and we catch and handle the exception in this catch block. And all we do is we print out the exception object EX that we're catching over here, and usually that prints out that message radius cannot be negative. That's what we expect to see. And finally, just to demonstrate that the code continues to execute after the catch block, I'm going to print out the value of number of objects created. Note that we'll never really get to this line in the try block, because by the time we create the second object C2, we'll already be handling, right after that we'll be handling an exception. So let me switch over to code. Same code that we just saw, and the test program, same test program. So let me run this. And there you go. So illegal argument exception, object radius cannot be negative, number of objects created is 1. So the second circle object C2 was never created, and we never got to the line that creates object C3.